UN Climate Change Conference, COP29, has gotten underway. Germany has reiterated its call for countries beyond the rich industrialized economies to contribute climate finance to developing countries if they have the means to do so. Now, Africa contributes the least of global greenhouse emissions, but it's significantly impacted. Joining us to discuss the conference and the message Africa should possibly be taking to the conference is Tina Costas, Director of Environmental and Commercial Law at Norton Rose Fulbright. Good evening, Tina. Thank you very much for joining us on the program. Now, you've published a comprehensive article on the need for Africa as a continent to speak in one voice more than ever before at this year's conference in order to almost address the imbalance on the impact of climate change versus the contribution to greenhouse emissions, which, of course, threatens the continent's development. Just talk to us about this.
So I think if we look at the current trajectory of global warming and climate change, we are unsustainable at the moment. And we can look at two reports as to where we are in the world. The UN Emission Gap Report is published every year before COP. And that shows that GHG emissions have risen to a new high of 57.1 gigatons of CO2 equivalent in 2023. We look at the six largest GHG emitters accounted for 63% of those global GHG emissions. And as you said, developed countries are only accounting for 3% of those emissions, whereas the large countries such as China, USA, India, Brazil, the EU are accounting for 63% of those global emissions. Where do we need to get to? Both reports have put out that United Nations Gap Emissions Report and the GST report on the global stocktake say that we need to cut emissions by 43% by 2030 and 60% by 2035. So there has to be a lot of action to get to where we want to get to for us to reach our goals in terms of the Paris Agreement.
But how important is it for the continent to speak in one voice this time, as you emphasize? Because this conversation or the statistics around the real contributors of these greenhouse emissions are unknown. And when we look at the continent, there's been that conversation ever so often to say we need to see the developed countries actually funding this just transition on the continent because they have contributed the most. Africa is not all that industrialized. So what is exactly stopping it, or why the need for you to call for greater alignment on the continent when they reach COP or as they have reached COP?
I think there's always been alignment between the global south, again, not against the global north, but understanding that there is that divide and there's that division just because of the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. There is that recognition that we contribute the least GHG emissions across Africa, but that we are going to be mostly impacted in terms of the effects of that. And we need to really speak in one voice. This COP is known as the finance COP, so each COP is given a name. COP27 was the Africa COP, COP28 was the action COP. This is the finance COP, and it's really important because there's going to be a focus on something called the new collective quantified goal on climate finance, and that really is how developed countries can be equitably financed to make the transition. There's going to be strong negotiations and discussions. This is going to be the major focus at COP29, really on what are the financial targets to support developing countries, how much funds are needed. It's really talking about the quality and the quantity of finance, importantly, and how accessible that finance is. It really is a strong, there's such a diversity of opinion in terms of the quality, the quantity, and the access of finance. Just to give you an example, just on the quantum, it ranges from how much is required. Is it $100 billion annually, or is it $1 trillion annually? So there's a huge divergence between developed and developing countries really on how much is required and the quantity and the quality of that finance.
And of course the conversation around whether it should be grants or loans, because when we speak about the impact, already the continent is feeling it. We hear from many experts that the kind of natural disasters that we're seeing now speak to climate change, but then ever so often when we speak to the experts, they also speak about, perhaps in South Africa, that we need to start constructing that climate resilient type of infrastructure. But again, that needs to be funded. We're most impacted, but we didn't industrialize to the extent where we had the financial reserves to ensure we have this climate resilient infrastructure.
Just to give you an idea of the amount, so the Presidential Climate Commission has issued figures, and 334 billion per annum is required to meet net zero by 2050. And then just to South Africa to meet its nationally determined contributions, they need to invest 1 trillion in mitigation and 10.9 trillion in adaptation. So those are huge figures. And as you said, it's looking at grant and concessional funding, not the debt financing. We need predictable funding that's fit for, the term is called fit for purpose.
Yeah.
It must not be something that's going to exacerbate a debt crisis that we're in, and existing funds can't be repackaged. So that's really the message that I think Africa and South Africa is going with in terms of the kind of financing that's required to fund this just transition, given the figures that are given from the PCC.
Now, Tina, this conference is taking place in Azerbaijan. It's a petro-state with big plans for natural gas extraction. The president was actually quite frank, also appealing to wealthier nations to assist the developing ones. Your take on just that frankness as a host nation?
Well, I think they're being honest and frank as to what they're doing. I think we need to have these honest discussions rather than promises and pledges that are not what's going to be given or what's going to be done. I think we had a discussion with the groups that are going with the South African delegation, and I think the message is that definitely from the Minister of Environmental Affairs is that be honest as to what you're going to be giving, what you're going to be doing, and so we know where we stand, and I think the world knows where it stands in terms of where it's going to get to and how it's going to get to it.
Tina, thank you very much for your time this evening. That's Tina Costas. She's Director of Environmental and Commercial Law at Norton Rose Fulbright, speaking to us there.